Okay, we've come a long way from those original 2 keyframes that we set, but we can take this even one more step further using another principle of animation. So I'm going to duplicate this one, hide that, and bring up the keyframes. Now, I think this is one of the most fun animation principles, and it's called squash and stretch. You've probably heard that term before, but if you've never used it yourself, then you're going to be in for a treat. So let's take a look at what exactly this is. The way that we're going to be incorporating squash and stretch is using another instance of the transform effect. So I'm going to just select this transform and rename it. You can rename any effect, just select it and press enter or return. And I'm going to call this one the rotation, just so I don't confuse it with the next instance. So I'm going to press Control Spacebar to bring up my effects console, type in transform and hit enter. And this one I'm going to rename squash and stretch. And that can be at the bottom of the effects stack, no problem. So there's my squash and stretch effect. I'm going to open it up because I need to again link the position to the anchor point, just like I did with the rotation. So remember, you just grab the property pick whip for that property and drag it to the anchor point. And now wherever the anchor point goes, the position value follows it. And before we go any further, let's just talk about the theory of squash and stretch for just a second. So the idea is that you can distort your animation to make it feel a little bit more cartoony. And in After Effects, it's as simple as using the scale property. So since we're doing this through the transform effect, I need to go into the uniform scale and uncheck that. And that will give me independent controls for the height and the width. So the very basic formula for squash and stretch is basically if you were to stretch in one direction, so let's say stretch upwards 125%, you need to squash in the opposite direction, so in this case the width, in an equal and opposite amount. So I went 25% higher than 100% on the height, so I need to take 25% off of the width. And what this is doing loosely is maintaining the volume of the layer. And that's pretty much what you want to do with squash and stretch. Now, there is another animation principle called exaggeration, and that's basically the do whatever you want card in the animation principles world. It's allowing you to have creative freedom to make your motion and your objects look however you want them to. But as a general rule of thumb, you want these two numbers to always add up to 200. So if you're adding something to one value, you need to take the same amount away from the other. So let's say I put the height down to 50, then I need to make sure that the width goes up to 150. So now it's super squashed out and wide. But we can write a tiny little expression to make this happen automatically. So let's just go down into our effect in the layers panel and take our width and add an expression to it. So I'm gonna hold down Option or Alt and click on that stopwatch and just delete what's in there. Just hit the backspace. And what we want to do is very simple. We just need to say 200, a value of 200 minus, and then grab this expression pick whip and drag it to the height. Let go, and it's going to fill in the expression that references that property. Finish it off with a semicolon and then click off. So we're going to give this scale width a value of 200 minus whatever this value is right here. So 200 minus 50 is 150. Those two numbers added together are 200. So now as I move the height value around, you can see that it is going in an equal and opposite distortion on the other property. So now I don't even have to think about that math. It's done automatically for me. I use that little tiny rig all the time for squash and stretch. It makes it a whole lot easier. And because I'm using the transform effect, and I've already set up my anchor point and position, I can drop this down to the bottom, which is a value of 350. And now I can squash and stretch that very easily off of that ground plane. And that's super cartoony. So that's a lot of fun, right? So let's set that down to 100. We'll set a keyframe on that scale height, and I'm gonna set a keyframe on that anchor point as well, and then press U to collapse and U one more time to bring up all my keyframes. Before I do anything else, I wanna again set a hold keyframe on that anchor point. So another quick way to do that is hold down Control Alt or Control Option on a Mac and click on that keyframe, and that converts it to a hold keyframe. I want this squash and stretch to happen at the beginning of my animation on the bottom right corner. So I'm gonna shift that anchor point value forward to 350. And I'm making sure that I'm still on top of that keyframe that I just set so that it modifies that value. So that is where I want it to squash and stretch from. But as it lifts up, I'm noticing that that anchor point is staying down here. And it reminded me that because of the way that I have my effects stacked, it's gonna rotate the layer first and then apply the squash and stretch. And that's not exactly what I want to happen. I want the squash and stretch to happen off of this corner. And because it's next in line basically after that rotation, it's going to stay down here. But if I just drag it up, then even though the anchor point didn't change, as far as this effect is concerned, it's still looking at this version of the layer. I just disabled the rotation. So it's going to squash and stretch off of the correct spot. So if I now grab my scale height right here, let me drag this out so we can see those value names. My scale height property, click and drag, you can see that it's scaling off of that point. So I just want to squash this down a little bit, maybe down to 85. And I'm not really doing this in any point in time. I should probably line this up with maybe the bend. So let's just look at those two properties. Scale height, control click on the bend and press SS. And we're just going to line these keyframes up. So it squashes and there's no easing yet. But next, I actually want to go right in the middle of the animation, which should be right about there. That looks like the center of the line of travel. And I'm gonna set another keyframe at a scale height of 85. And that'll make sense why in just a second. But then we'll go to right about, let's say right here where the extreme of that bend is. And we're going to go in the opposite direction, maybe 115. So instead of taking 15% away, we're now adding 15%. So it's stretching upwards in the opposite direction. And then we'll do our same overshoot type animation where we back up in the opposite direction of the resting point, just a few units, so maybe 92%, and then we'll go to the next keyframe and go to maybe 102%, and then finally at 100%. So just to recap, we are squashing down as it rotates back, which now that I look at it, actually might make more sense to stretch that up. So maybe we go to 115. So it's kind of like it's standing up tall and rotating back before slapping down. And in that case, this actually should probably be on the opposite corner. So let's press U to find that hold keyframe, which is right here. And I'll just align it with the first keyframe of my squash and stretch. And I'm just gonna back this up. So it's rotating off of that back left corner, the same corner that it's rotating on. And now it's really stretching upwards. And I could probably exaggerate that even more. So let's go up to 125. So now it's rotating back, bending and stretching upwards before slapping down and moving forward and getting squashed at this middle point. And I think I'm gonna exaggerate that even further as well. So we'll go to 75. Okay, and then at the end of the animation, we need that anchor point back on the other side. So I need to find a point that I can move it. And it can't really be anywhere I want because with the scale value changed, if I move that anchor point, you see that it's shifting the contents around. So what I need to do is basically switch the anchor point at a point in time where it's close to 100%. So none of my easing is done yet, so I don't exactly know where that will be. So for the time being, this timing for this keyframe is probably going to be off. But I'll just set a value of 350 right there so it switches to the other corner. And now it's going to stretch on the opposite corner. And I'm gonna do this pretty extreme as well, make this more extreme. 125, and then down to say 85, then back up to 105 before finally getting to that resting value of 100. So now that we have our values and our timing pretty well set, let's go into the value graph and ease all of this. It's all very rigid right now. And take a look at how this is going to affect our motion. Okay, so it's actually not looking too bad, but we can definitely make it look better, just like we did with the bend it effect. So I'm going to stretch into this keyframe a little more quickly and really squash into this keyframe pretty quickly as well and stay there until right about there. That's probably where we need this to be at 100. So I'm just going to add another keyframe for a scale value of 100, and we can ease this however we need to. So I'm just gonna make it about there. But now I have a specific frame in time where I know the value is 100 and I can safely change my anchor point for that squash and stretch, knowing it's not going to affect the position of that square at all. Okay, so now that we did that, I can go back in and finesse my squash and stretch a little bit more. And just adjust these curves on the final part of the animation a little bit more. And let's play it back and see what it looks like. Oh yeah, that looks really good. It adds a lot more life. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can really see what's happening here. And just so we can really isolate the squash and stretch, I'm actually going to just disable the rotation and the bend it. So the only distortion we're getting is from the squash and stretch. And I want to show you that even just on its own, squash and stretch can work as an anticipation and follow through technique. You know, on its own, it's telling us a lot about the motion. It's giving us that anticipation where it stretches up before it squashes down, accentuating that motion, right? So as it's moving faster, it's really squashing down and then snapping back into its stretched out point. And we're using the overshoot to really convey all of this motion, the energy and momentum of this movement, the simple movement that we've been working with this entire time, moving from one side of the composition to the other. So on its own, it works really well, but you can combine it with other distortions like bend it to give that simple motion a lot more personality. And including that rotation just gives even more movement and visual cues of what's about to happen and makes it all a lot more playful. So we've made 7 versions of this box. So why don't we just really quickly show all of them back to back. So I'm just gonna edit here so you don't have to watch me do this. But what I've done is now just sequenced each one of these boxes so that we can watch the entire animation of each one play out back to back. So let's take a look at the first one, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see it nice and clearly. This was our linear movement, right? There was no easing at all. It's just 2 keyframes, position values going between the 2 sides of the screen. All right, next up was adding the easing to our keyframes, right? So now it just eases in and out, and we did modify that value graph a little bit. And that really can be considered one of the principles of animation, that slow in and slow out, or ease in and ease out. Makes it look a lot better already, but then we took it a step further and we added that anticipation at the beginning. So just a very subtle movement, but it gives the viewer a cue of what's about to happen. Okay, next up, we included not only anticipation, but also that follow through. So very similar to anticipation, just in the opposite end of the motion. Next up, we added in a transform effect, and that gave us the ability to rotate that layer on specific points. So the anticipation and follow through is now happening with not the position value, but the rotation value. So we're animating on 2 different properties, and it just gives a different feel. Then we added in some overlap, the next principle of animation, which we used the bend it effect to incorporate, but that allowed different parts of the object to move at different times. And overlapping that motion really brings a lot of personality into your animation. And then finally, we incorporated squash and stretch, one of my favorite principles of animation, that really added a lot of bendiness and jiggliness to our animation that brings a very simple square to life, giving it a lot more personality than where we started with just a box moving across the composition. And all of these animation principles can be used in any form of animation. It doesn't have to be just inside of After Effects. You could be working in a 3D program like Cinema 4D, or animating frame by frame, drawing every frame by hand, or even doing stop motion animation. It all applies to every form of animation, and that's why it's so critical to understand these principles, because you can combine them and use them together. And you saw just how much effort I was putting into the easing of all of those keyframes and overlapping them and incorporating all of these principles. That's really what it takes to make beautiful motion. You need to get in there, look at the tiny details, modify things a lot, and just be watching it back until you are happy with the way that it looks. So I really want to encourage you to get in there and open up this project file, practice this yourself, and do these exercises the same way that I did. Just make a very simple motion, duplicate the layer, hide the first one, and try and make it look better on the next version, and just see how far you can push your animations. I would love to see what you come up with. So if you have something that you want to share, go ahead and post that to the class project so that I can take a look. But once you feel like you've got a good understanding and grasp on these fundamental animation principles, then you can move on to making your own class project in the rest of this class.